Hello Algebra 1. In this video lesson we're going to continue with what we've been talking about models and using models to solve problems. Specifically, how to use models to solve word problems. I call this part 2 because we already talked a little bit about this in the last video lesson. And now we're going to apply that to a word problem like this. So for example, let's suggest that you are asked this question. Well, first of all, one of the problems that I have with the way this question has been worded is that I think the letter H here is a little bit confusing. Saying that H is your sister's height, when you're talking about two different people, your own height, where you're 18 inches taller, and your sister's height, I think it's a little confusing to give H to your sister. So I would suggest when you're setting these problems up, feel free to change the letters if you need to. If I change that to S, then I'm going to be clear that I'm talking about the sister's height. So with that in place, I hope it's a little easier to see which of these two is the right version that represents the story above. In the equation on the left, A, we're saying that S, or your sister's height, minus 18 should be equal to 65. Is that true, or is it B, where your sister's height plus 18 is equal to 65? So stop for a second and think about it, and then I'll come back. Well, I hope you can see, since after all it does say that you are the one who's 18 inches taller, that it really ought to be B, that your sister needs to add 18 inches in order to become as tall as you, in order to become 65 inches tall. Let's try another one that's similar to that. In this case, this model plane story talks about two different models of planes. By the way, I just kind of assume that you can pause at any point and read the paragraph to yourself, so I'm not going to read it to you. But there are two different kinds of planes in this story. There's the propeller plane and the jet. And they're using X for the jet. Again, I think that letter doesn't tell you very much. I'd rather use a letter that does, so I've changed it to J. And now that I have, I've got two different choices of equations that are supposed to represent the story. You tell me which one's right, A or B. Hit the pause button, and when you come back, we'll talk about it. Okay, I'm going to assume that you did that, and A is the right answer, because after all, it is the jets plus the propeller planes, and the propeller planes rather are J minus 7. There are 7 fewer propeller planes than jets, so the propeller planes are the J minus 7. Together with the jets, they all add up to 15 because it says the total collection is 15. So A is the right answer. Okay, using that kind of skill to write your own equation, not choosing between two, but having to write one from scratch, well, let's look at this story. It's a fairly short story, and in this case, I'm content with I'm comfortable with the letters that they've chosen. S for school, C for community center. Notice it's never going to be perfect. It's a community center swimming pool, so you might have said S for this, I suppose. But I'm going to live with S and C in this case. Hit the pause button and come back, and let's see if you come up with the same equation that I would have. Okay, I'm going to assume that you did that. And that's what I came up with, that the distance to school is equal to the distance to the community center plus 1/5 of a mile. Now, the textbook goes from here to start talking about verbal models and how to write a verbal model. And as they explain in the simplest diagram here, you start by writing a verbal model, then you assign labels. In other words, you put in variables and numbers in place of the words of the verbal model, and then you turn that into an algebraic model. So, for example, and this is obviously taken straight from the textbook, they have this story about you buying plates of food at a dim sum lunch at a Chinese restaurant. And one of the things they point out that I think is kind of nice, nice of them, they don't always, is they point out that the tax is added, and it's added after. So what does that mean? Well, in terms of a verbal model, you've got the cost per plate times the number of plates, and that's going to be equal to the total cost minus the tax. The tax is added afterward. So the total cost, which was $25.20, includes tax. So if you want to figure out how much was for the food, it's the total cost minus the tax. And again, the way you figure out your food cost is simply, it's always the same price per plate, $2 per plate, times the number of plates. Well, I'm kind of giving it away here because they go on from here and they go from the verbal model, which is this thing, to assigning the labels. And I just want to show you what the textbook means when it says assigning labels. This is, in this category here, this is where they're assigning the labels before they write the algebraic model. And they're saying that the cost per plate, they're just going to change it to 2. They really should have made it $2 to make it clearer. And they similarly should have called it P plates, but that's okay. They're calling it 2 and then P and then 2520 and 120. Those four things, 2, P, 2520, and 120, those are the labels they're talking about. So now, changing that to an algebraic model, you end up simply removing that brown box there and seeing that it's 2 times P, or in other words, 2 for cost, P for plates, is equal to 2520, in other words, the bill, minus 120, in other words, the tax. But what you really wanted, after all, was not this equation. You wanted to know what P is. You wanted to know what the number of plates was. Remember, it's right here. How many plates? So, if you're supposed to solve the equation to find how many plates there are, you're not done here. You're supposed to get to an equation and then figure out what P is. Okay, so here we are. They've worked it out. 2P is equal to 2520 minus 120, or in other words, 2P is equal to $24. If you divide that by $2, you'll find that P is 12. Don't lose track of what you've done, though, here. P equals 12 is not your answer. Your answer is that you ordered 12 plates of food. Okay, let's see if you can apply that now. Just looking at the sentences up here and then number 29, go ahead and write your own verbal model for this story about the recycling center. Hit the pause button, and when you come back, we'll talk that through. Okay, I'm hoping you found that that was a fairly simple verbal model to put together, and I hope you came up with something like this. 5 cents per can times the number of cans that you have totaled $4. Now the next step is to write an algebraic model based on the verbal model. So again, hit the pause button, do it yourself, and then I'll show you. Okay, I'm going to assume again that you did that. And here's the verbal model that, the algebraic model that I came up with. It's 0.05 times cans, or in other words, 0.05C is equal to $4. Notice I've gone ahead and left the units in there because I don't want to get lost. Now, the third and final step is to solve the equation. Once again, hit the pause button, do that, and come back, and we'll talk that through. Okay, I'm going to assume that you completed that last step. The key part of solving this equation is realizing that what you're supposed to do is figure out what C is. That's the question. So in order to get C by itself, you've got to divide both sides by 0.05. And if you do that and cancel out the 0.05s on the left, you'll find that it turns out that C is equal to 80. But 80 what? Don't lose track of that. It's 80 cans. That's the solution to the equation, 80 cans. So in other words, you took 80 cans to the recycling center, you got paid 5 cents for every one of those cans, and in total you got $4. Okay, now here's a harder one for you to put this all together for. This one I will read through just to make sure it's clear what we're talking about. You're running for class president, and we've counted the votes part of the way through the total count. And part of the way through, you found you've got 95 votes. Think of it as 95 points in a game if you want. And your opponent has 120 votes, or 120 points if you want. But there are 45 more students who still have yet to vote. So they say, let X represent the number of students that's out of the 45 who are going to vote for you. So in other words, this is the key point that I think people are going to get lost on. You're going to get some of the 45. Your opponent's going to get some of the 45. The portion that you're going to get is going to be called X. Now you're supposed to write an inequality. So go ahead and do that, hit the pause button, and come back. Okay, I hope you did that. Here's what I put down at the beginning. I just said your votes have to be more than your opponent's votes. But actually it's more than that, isn't it? It's your votes plus something they said that's going to be X. It has to be greater than your opponent's votes. Your opponent's going to get some. In fact, your opponent's going to get the rest of the 45. Now, let's apply some logic to that. It's X out of the 45. It's the rest of the 45. So I'm simply going to call this x, but I'm going to try to remember that that's the rest of the 45. Now how do I turn this verbal model into an algebraic model? Well, remember, your votes is 95. X stays the same. The opponent has 120. The rest is 45 minus x. Now, if you start cleaning that up, reminding yourself the key point is that your side has to be more than theirs or you don't win. You're trying to figure out what x is. Well, you've written the inequality at least. That was step 1, and you're done. But step 2 is the next step. What's the smallest value of x that's a solution? In other words, what's the minimum number of votes you need to get out of the remaining 45 in order to win? Hit the pause button, come back, and I'll show you the answer. Okay, I'm going to assume that you did that. Now, the way to figure this out, the smallest value has to be 1 higher than equals. If the two sides are equal, neither side wins. So you want 1 more than equals. So let's first figure out what equals is, and then we can go 1 higher than that number. So what we need to do is, on the left we've got 95 plus x. On the right we've got 120 plus that 45 minus x. Let's get the x's together on one side, and the 95 with the other constants on the other side. That means you're adding x to the left, subtracting 95 to the right. If you clean that up, you find you've got 2x on the left, 70 on the right. Well, that means x is 36. So, I'm sorry, yeah, 35. X is 35, my mistake. But you need 1 higher in order to win. So you need 36 votes, and you'll find that 95 plus 36, if you put that together, is 131, and your opponent would have had 129, and you would win. So you need 36 out of the remaining 45 votes in order to win. The last thing that we looked at was the page that talked about guess, check, and revise. I'm looking at the clock and realizing I'm at 12 minutes already. I just don't want to overrun. So I'm going to stop this at 12 minutes, and I'm going to make a short mini video just about guess, check, and revise.